What is the first celebrity death you remember? Elvis, though it didn't really have an effect on me. John Lennon was more memorable, and not just because I was a little more familiar with his music. My brother and I had a paper route and we'd set up our papers before 6 a.m. in our NYC apartment building lobby. Several of our early morning boomer neighbors, leaving for work and having gone to bed before the news came out, stopped dead in their tracks in shock when they saw the front page. Felt bad when we had to take back the paper we were letting them read. Heath Ledger. People who watch The Dark Knight now don't realize the immense anticipation we had for that movie before the movie came out. There was a huge conversation about how amazing Ledger's portrayal of the Joker was. To this day, The Dark Knight is the only movie that not only lived up to the extremely high expectation but it exceeded it phenomenally. Ledger was also the first actor to win an Oscar based off a comic book movie. René Klein, a Dutch singer. I vividly remember him appearing on a Dutch comedy show to perform a song. He had HIV, was severely underweight and had to perform lying down on a couch. The whole performance had a profound impact on me even though I was around 10-11 years old. This performance was in 1992. He died a year later, and the amount of respect I had for him for that performance made the news of his death so much stronger. Michael Jackson. While I've heard about celebrities dying way before that, the death of Michael Jackson happened at a time when I was starting to take a more active interest in the world around me and starting to become an adolescent. I had listened to Michael Jackson's music all the way through childhood and was a huge fan. Hearing on the radio that he died was therefore a huge gut punch, and it left me quite numb for days. Dale Earnhardt. A race car driver. People here lost it, making signs, shirts, car stickers. I didn't know just how many people listened to racing on their radio. You'd see a bomber jacket that had Forever 3 on the back, and apparently he was 3. The local stores started selling all kinds of memorabilia. I remember a plaque that was a clock with M on it depicted as "I guess in the sky is heaven." Trucker hats. Cobain was first and we all sat around watching MTV, but the death of Ayrton Senna, less than a month later, was more impactful to me. I used to get up early on weekends as a kid to watch him race. He was my favorite driver in F1. Dale was my favorite Winston Cup driver, and his death killed motorsports for me. I don't watch because I was too out of two, and I don't want another favorite dying on the track. At 8 years old I was a big WWF fan with all the toys and everything and loved The Princess Bride, so it hit me pretty hard when Andre the Giant died. He was the first celebrity I remember dying, and it taught me that even the mightiest people pass away. My older brother and dad also talked a lot about Sam Kinison dying when it happened, but he wasn't someone I was familiar with since I was young. Christopher Reeves. Only because my uncle was in the hospital for falling off a roof, and guess what happened? He became quadriplegic. Now that I'm thinking about it, it might have been Reagan who died when my uncle was in the hospital. It would be too much of a coincidence if it was Reeves. But one of their deaths was on the news in the waiting room. Jerry Garcia. I was 13 and hadn't found the Grateful Dead yet. I had known, at the time, who he was, but it wasn't the biggest deal for me. Fast forward 3 years and that man whose death I hardly had noticed had become the center of my universe and still plays a massive part in my life. Sometimes I still feel like I was born a decade too late. George Carlin. I was 15 and a giant fan of his. I just remember my friend calling me in the middle of the day to tell me that he died. We didn't speak that often, so the fact that he went out of his way to call my house showed what a big deal it was. The next year, that same friend called me again to tell me that Michael Jackson died. John Lennon. I was 4 at the time, and because of this, I keep getting told that I couldn't possibly remember it. But I remember as clear as day the news report telling us that he'd been shot dead. Even at that age, I knew who John Lennon was and that he was in the Beatles, so I instinctively knew how big a news story it was. Sam Kinison. I was like 9, but I remember hearing it on the news and my aunt losing her mind. It affected my parents as well. I was too young to watch his shows, but I knew who he was. I thought it was weird how they were reacting until one of my favorite celebrities died. I didn't go nuts like they did, but it hurt. Princess Diana. Also, I remember Jill Dando's murder 2 years later. Was very prolific when I was a kid. She was a BBC presenter, not sure if it broke the news internationally, but her name was embedded in my head as a small child. Didn't realize how insane that case was till much later. Either Heather O'Rourke or Judith Barsi. I was about 4 and couldn't comprehend people that young dying. I don't think my parents explained Barsi's death at the time, but vaguely remember paying attention to news broadcasts and having their pictures filmed clips grab my attention. Probably Tommy Cooper. Back in the 70s as a kid I didn't read newspapers or watch the news, so plenty of deaths would have gone unnoticed. Tommy Cooper dying on stage on live TV in 1984 was the talk of the school the next day, so the first I can remember. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, I remember being in my dad's pickup truck. And then a few months later, Celia Cruz, I was again in my dad's pickup truck. We were driving to buy some furniture. Most of my news was from the radio at that time. Lowell, Elvis. Then John Lennon. I was really young when Elvis died, but remembered my mom freaking out. She was a big fan and had just rode with her friends about 200 miles to just pose at the gates of Graceland a year or so before I was born. Freddie Mercury. My teacher talked about it at school also to discuss AIDS. She was a very progressive teacher for the early 90s, I think she was also a big Queen fan. Then I remember seeing it discussed on the news the same day. Besides Princess Diana, probably Aaliyah. I was 9 when Aaliyah passed and I remember crying in the car when I heard it on the radio. I think that was the first time my mom realized I knew how to actually process death. Dale Earnhardt or Princess Diana, not sure which one came first, but both times I was with one of my grandparents. Dale Earnhardt is the only thing I remember from the trip I was on with my grandma and aunt. So weird. Michael Jackson, I can remember everything about that day vividly. I remember where I was, how we found out about the news. For like the next week the only thing played on my TV were his highlights and music videos. The first one I remember was Steve Irwin. I was technically alive for Princess Diana's death, but I was 3. I honestly grew up thinking she had passed away before my time since it was such a historical passing. Mr. Rogers. I was 7, I taped his obituary to my wall and had a meltdown when my mom took it down. She tried to tell me it was okay because I could still watch his shows, as if that was what I was upset about. Lol. First one I recall being vaguely aware of Elvis. First one I definitely remember watching about on TV, the new pope that died after about 3 weeks, John Paul I. First one that shocked me, John Lennon. It was Prince Edward who was the king. I remember it because I had to get the whole abdication thing explained to me. It was confusing for a kid to learn he was a prince, became a king and died as a prince. The first one I remember as being meaningful to Denver. I'd been listening and crying to his music relentlessly 2-3 days before as I went through a tough time, and it was so sad and unsettling. John Lennon. I was born after the Beatles broke up, but they were on heavy rotation in my house growing up. I was 6 when it happened, and didn't really understand it. My brother was 11, he took it hard. Elvis. I was 7. I remember my neighbor crying. Then my dad got a 45 revolutions per minute of a song called The King Is Gone, sung by someone who sang exactly like Elvis, so I was very confused. He played it over and over, Elvis Presley, and for the life of me I couldn't figure out why everyone was upset. I don't remember the young Elvis, just the old, fat, sweaty, greasy, couldn't remember the words of songs Elvis. SRD. I discovered him maybe 8 months earlier and was a bonding thing with my pops. We were on our way to play tennis and we heard. We turned around and went home and listened to his records. Bill Goldberg, the wrestler. I was such a fan back then, and when they pretended he died in the ring I was stupid enough to believe it. Found out a few years later that he was alive and well. Michael Jackson. I was in class when the intercom came on. It was a very big silence for 5 minutes, then we all heard that the principal said, "Michael Jackson has left us today." I was 9. Elvis Presley, my next door neighbor, who was a builder that was full of Cockney banter, came out of his house crying. I hadn't seen a grown man cry before that, being a young kid. I vaguely remember Sharon Tate's murder. I lived in NJ, but the Tate LaBianca murders became news across the country because of her death. My mom followed the story. Diana, I think. I remember specifically not caring and walking away from the TV at Derwent Hill on a school trip was a summer thing and getting wronged for being disrespectful. Rock Hudson was the first I remember. It was a big deal that he died of AIDS, which was primarily affecting the gay community at the time, and everyone assumed he was straight. John Ritter. I was only 11. My grandma always let us stay up to watch Three's Company when we spent the night, and I loved 8 Simple Rules. I bawled like I actually knew him, because my mother was so distressed during this event. As a 4 years old I remember her crying when JFK's small son saluted his father's grave at Arlington Cemetery in November 1963. The first one I was acutely aware of was Michael Jackson. I was 8 and hanging out at the pool, and it was all anybody was talking about, both there and when I got home. Lucille Ball, just because I remember my grandmother crying when it happened. Freddie Mercury dying seemed to break the world for a few days. I vividly remember that time. Elvis. I asked my mom who he was. She cried a little as he was on her bucket list. To be clear, my mom would have banked Elvis in a heartbeat at any point in his career. John Lennon. I was walking past the electronics section of a department store when they announced it on the radio. I remember that so clearly, but I'm not sure why. JonBenet Ramsey. She's not a celebrity, but she did become famous after her death. We were the same age at the time, so it was definitely more memorable to me. I'm old, so it was Nicholas Colasanto. He played Coach on Cheers. For some reason, I wrote about it in my diary when it happened. I was a weird 9-year-old kid. Michael Jackson. I was 19. We had just gotten home from somewhere, and as soon as our dad opened the door, he greeted us by saying Michael Jackson died. Jim Henson and Muppets. I was 4, my older brother was devastated. I feel like it was the first time I grasped that someone who died was gone forever. Michael Jackson as well. I remember we woke up from nap time in kindergarten and all the teachers were talking about it and were also shocked. Cass Elliot. I remember because I was with my older cousins and they talked about her choking on a ham sandwich, which wasn't reported at the time. John Lennon. I was 5 at the time, and my older siblings. I remember sobbing and wearing black school ties on Tuesday, the day after he was killed. Michael Jackson is the first I can clearly remember. The reason? I was driving for 7 hours that day. And the tribute songs went the whole time. Anissa Jones. She played Buffy on Family Affair. Jones. John Lennon. I also remember the Iranians taking the US Embassy in Iran over and taking all those hostages. I was in middle school at the time.